I will not serve a Blay CK mistress.
The grand staircase of Ravenswood Hall descended in sweeping curves of Italian marble, each step a monument to centuries of accumulated wealth and power, and standing at its apex in ivory silk trimmed with Belgian lace, a gown that had taken 3 months to construct and cost more than a country vicar earned in a year, stood Amara Blackwell, the new Countess of Ravenswood. Her skin, the deep mahogany of her Jamaican mother's African heritage, seemed to absorb the light from the crystal chandeliers above, and her dark eyes blazed with a defiant pride that no amount of aristocratic etiquette could suppress. Behind her, descending step by step with measured grace, his gloved hand resting on her arm, in a gesture that spoke of partnership rather than possession, came Edmund Blackwell, Earl of Ravenswood, 35 years old and acutely aware that every eye in Ravenswood Hall was fixed upon them with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed revulsion. At the bottom of the marble staircase, where generations of Blackwell heirs had made their grand descents, stood Jasper Whitmore, the butler. 58 years old, his uniform impeccable as always, black morning coat, white gloves pressed to perfection, silver hair combed with military precision. He embodied the institutional memory of the household, yet every muscle in his body had gone rigid. His jaw had clenched so tightly his teeth might shatter. His eyes, which had gazed upon countless aristocratic visitors with professional neutrality, now burned with something that transcended mere disapproval. It was something far more dangerous, absolute moral certainty. The assembled servants, housemaids in their starched caps, footmen in their livery, scullery workers who had ventured upstairs for this momentous occasion, stood frozen against the wallpapered walls. They were witnesses to a moment that would define the future of Ravenswood Hall, though none of them yet understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The gaslights flickered softly, a chandelier crystal trembled with tension, and in that crystalline moment, as Amara's slippered foot touched the final step and she turned toward the household staff, Jasper Whitmore stepped directly into her path, blocking her passage like a moral barrier made flesh. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was controlled, deliberate, and laden with the weight of absolute conviction. "I will not serve a black mistress," he said, each word precisely articulated, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile peace Edmund had tried to construct. "I will tender my resignation effective immediately, Your Grace. I will not remain in a house that has betrayed the honor of English blood. Not now, not ever." The words hung in the air like poison gas, invisible yet lethal, spreading through every corner of the entrance hall and beyond, seeping into the consciousness of every servant present. Edmund's face flushed a deep crimson, the color rising from his neck to his temples as the full humiliation of the moment crashed over him. This was not merely an insult to his new wife. This was a direct challenge to his authority as master of Ravenswood Hall, a public declaration by his most senior household servant that the natural order of things had been violated beyond redemption. And Amara, in that single moment when Jasper's words landed like physical blows, understood with crystalline clarity that her marriage to the man she loved had just declared war on the very foundations of the world she had entered. She would either conquer this hostile empire or be destroyed by it. Before we continue with this tale of dignity tested against prejudice, of a woman who refused to be invisible in spaces designed to erase her, we invite you to let us know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment your country or city below. We love connecting with viewers from across the globe who share our fascination with history's darkest moments and brightest acts of courage. For what unfolds next at Ravenswood Hall would test not merely one woman's resolve, but the conscience of an entire household, an entire society, and indeed an entire empire built upon hierarchies of blood and nation. Edmund had travelled to Jamaica in 1876 with the confident arrogance of an English aristocrat inspecting his family's colonial holdings. The sugar plantations of Jamaica had enriched the Blackwell estate for 2 centuries, those brutal engines of wealth that powered British prosperity through the labour of enslaved people, men and women whom the law had deemed not fully human, whose blood and sweat had been transformed into the marble beneath Amara's feet and the Belgian lace that adorned her gown. He had come to oversee the transition to so-called free labour following the abolition of slavery 16 years prior, to ensure that the family's profits continued unabated despite the removal of chattel bondage. What he had not expected to find was her. Amara St. James stood on the gallery of the plantation great house, dressed in a white muslin gown that caught the tropical breeze, reading a book in French, not merely reading, but annotating it with critical marginalia, her mind actively engaged with ideas rather than passively consuming them. Her father, the plantation's overseer, had brought her down from the schoolroom to assist with correspondence. Edmund had been struck first by her beauty. That would be dishonest to deny, but far more profoundly by her mind. She was the daughter of an English plantation overseer and an enslaved woman named Zainab, who had borne his child while still legally property, who had gained her freedom only through the abolition that rendered slavery itself illegal. Amara had been raised in her father's household, educated by a French governess paid for with plantation profits, fluent in English and French, and capable of discussing philosophy, literature, and the sciences, with an intellect that matched or exceeded Edmund's own. Yet for all her education, for all her father's attempts to create a place for her within English respectability, she existed in a perpetual limbo. She was too educated for the enslaved population from which her mother had emerged. She was too dark-skinned, too visibly marked by African heritage to be accepted as truly English. The world she inhabited offered her neither full acceptance nor any socially sanctioned role. She was neither one thing nor another, condemned to perpetual outsider status by the very biology that made her extraordinary. Edmund found himself spending hours in conversation with her, initially telling himself these were innocent intellectual discussions about colonial administration and agricultural economics. But they were far more than that. They were conversations about justice, about the brutality embedded in the plantation system itself, about the fundamental contradiction between English claims of Christian civilization and the reality of enslaved bodies working beneath the tropical sun. Amara spoke with a passion that transcended mere academic interest. She spoke from lived knowledge, from watching her mother work despite her freedom, because no other employment was available to a black woman, from understanding intimately the price paid by those deemed racially inferior for the comfort of those deemed racially superior. By December 1877, when Edmund proposed to her beneath a mango tree, heavy with fruit, he did so knowing full well the firestorm his choice would ignite in English society. He promised her a title, the Countess of Ravenswood, one of England's oldest peerages. He promised her a place in English aristocratic society, access to salons and drawing rooms and the corridors of power. He promised her partnership and equality, a marriage of minds and hearts, rather than mere legal transaction. What he did not promise, because he could not fully comprehend it in that moment, of tropical romance, was true acceptance. He did not promise that centuries of racial hierarchy could be overturned by the power of individual love. Amara accepted his proposal because she loved him. That was true and undeniable. She accepted it also because Jamaica held only profoundly limited futures for a woman of her complexion and status. She would never be permitted to marry a white man of her father's social class. She would be condemned to exist as a perpetual oddity, an educated Mixed-race woman without place or purpose, but she accepted primarily because she desperately hoped, perhaps foolishly, perhaps courageously, perhaps both, that love and titles and the sheer force of her own dignity could overcome centuries of institutionalized racial prejudice. They married quietly in Jamaica in February 1878, announced the marriage to his family by letter as though the deed were already done and could not be undone, and sailed for England in April aboard a ship that carried them toward either transcendence or catastrophe. Edmund had expected disapproval from London society when news of the marriage spread through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs like wildfire. He had braced himself for whispered scandals at the House of Lords, for cutting remarks disguised as concern about his judgment, for invitations to withdraw from certain circles. What he had profoundly miscalculated was his own household's capacity for coordinated resistance. The servants of Ravenswood Hall did not question their master's decisions through overt rebellion. Such things would be unseemly, improper, grounds for immediate dismissal without reference. Instead, they resisted through the quiet, invisible mechanisms of domestic sabotage that have always been the servant class's most powerful weapon against those they served. Amara's first morning as the Countess of Ravenswood, she descended to the breakfast room expecting to find the silver coffee service waiting, the morning papers arranged, fresh flowers in the Sèvres vases. Instead, she found a single cold plate of toast and a pot of tea so lukewarm it might never have been hot. The eggs that appeared an hour later were congealed and unappetizing. When she rang for the housemaid to request that her chambers be properly aired, the girl arrived with such visible reluctance that Amara understood immediately. This was not mere incompetence, but a choreographed performance of disdain. Her bathwater arrived tepid. Her gowns, laid out for pressing, were returned wrinkled and carelessly folded. The household was speaking to her without words, communicating through the language of deliberate failure. Mrs. Constance Weatherby, the housekeeper who had served the Blackwell family since childhood and had raised 3 generations of servants within Ravenswood Hall's hierarchy, presided over this quiet insurrection with the skill of a general commanding troops. She was 55 years old, dressed always in black silk, with a chatelaine of keys that jingled with the weight of her authority, and she viewed Amara's presence as nothing less than an unforgivable corruption of aristocratic blood. She had served the previous countess, Edmund's mother, with absolute loyalty, and she could not fathom how her beloved master's son could have betrayed his class and his heritage so thoroughly as to marry a woman of mixed race. In Mrs. Weatherby's mind, Amara represented not merely an unsuitable marriage, but a fundamental violation of the natural order that she had spent her life maintaining. Yet it was Jasper Whitmore who orchestrated the deeper rebellion. As butler, he occupied a unique position within the household hierarchy. He was senior to the housekeeper in matters of household protocol, answerable directly to the master, and responsible for the presentation of the family to visitors and society. His refusal to acknowledge Amara as the rightful countess rippled through the entire household like a tremor, through water. The footman, following his lead, executed her orders with visible resentment. The housemaids, taking their cues from Mrs. Weatherby, performed their duties with such obvious reluctance that even the most trivial tasks became exercises in humiliation. And most cruelly, invitations to society events began to mysteriously fail to arrive. Cards that should have been delivered by the post were somehow lost or delayed, ensuring that Amara would miss crucial social occasions where she might have established herself among England's elite. Edmund attempted to intervene, but his efforts only illuminated the depth of the household's resolve. When he ordered that Amara be treated with the same respect accorded to any countess, Jasper acknowledged the command with a bow so stiff it was almost a mockery of respect. Orders were followed, but followed so technically, so literally, with such careful exactitude and utter lack of any genuine service, that the atmosphere in Ravenswood Hall became increasingly toxic. It was as though the household had become a stage set for a performance of loyalty while simultaneously conducting a quiet campaign of psychological warfare designed to break Amara's spirit and force Edmund to renounce his marriage. The true catastrophe arrived in May, when Edmund's mother, the Dowager Countess Elizabeth Blackwell, arrived from the family estate in Yorkshire without announcement or warning. She was 62 years old, dressed in the elaborate mourning of a perpetually grieving widow, and she entered Ravenswood Hall like an invading general claiming her rightful territory. She had not come to congratulate her son on his marriage. She had come to wage war against it. That very evening, she summoned the household staff and announced publicly that she would never, under any circumstances, acknowledge Amara as her daughter-in-law, and that she considered Edmund's marriage to be a temporary fit of tropical madness that she intended to remedy through whatever means necessary. Over the following weeks, the Dowager Countess weaponized her social position with terrifying effectiveness. She was an old woman of impeccable aristocratic lineage, and her opposition to Amara was framed not as racist prejudice, but as concern for the family's honor and Edmund's temporary colonial degeneracy. She dined with society matrons and hinted delicately that the marriage had been contracted under conditions of duress or mental incapacity. She suggested, with perfectly calibrated vagueness, that Amara's background might be far less respectable than Edmund's public statements suggested. She reminded anyone who would listen of the family's centuries of aristocratic purity, now compromised by a colonial liaison. Most devastatingly, she began to suggest that the marriage might be legally challengeable, that under common law, a spouse deemed unsuitable or misrepresented could be grounds for annulment. The immediate stakes of this domestic warfare were social death. If the household staff could force Edmund to dismiss Amara through sheer passive resistance, if society could be poisoned against her before she established herself in even a single drawing room, she would be cast out with nothing. An annulment would follow, declared with the fiction of mutual agreement, but understood by everyone to be a repudiation. She would return to Jamaica disgraced, her marriage erased, her hopes destroyed. Edmund would resume his place in society within a season or two. Society forgave much of aristocratic men, particularly when they were willing to acknowledge their mistakes. But Amara would be permanently marked as the woman who had attempted to rise above her station and had failed. The deeper personal stakes were even more terrifying because Amara could not yet speak them aloud. She was pregnant. She had suspected it for 2 weeks, but had not yet confirmed it with absolute certainty, choosing instead to sit alone in her chambers and confront the reality that her child, Edmund's child, would inherit not merely a title, but also a mother's struggle for survival. If she bore a son, he would be heir to an earldom and all its estates. If society accepted the marriage, the child would represent a triumph of love over prejudice, a living symbol that blood and heritage were far more complex than the rigid racial hierarchies that Victorian England took for granted. But if the marriage failed, her child would be declared a bastard born of an unsuitable union, a mixed-race child with no legitimate claim to his father's name or estates, no future in English society, no protection. Amara understood with crystalline precision that the battle would be won or lost not in drawing rooms, but in the household itself. If she could win the loyalty and respect of the servants, if she could transform them from instruments of her humiliation into defenders of her position, then Ravenswood Hall itself would become her domain, and her fortress. A household unified behind a countess could weather almost any external storm, a household in rebellion, would poison every aspect of her existence and eventually force Edmund into an impossible choice between his wife and his family's peace. She had studied English society through books and observation during her months in Jamaica, understanding that survival required her to be simultaneously invisible and impeccable, both stronger and more gracious than any English countess would ever need to be. She had one asset that most aristocratic women did not possess. She had nothing to lose by being extraordinary. Amara's strategy began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a single act of deliberate kindness. The scullery maid, a girl named Catherine, no older than 16, had arrived at Ravenswood Hall only weeks before the new countess, and she was struggling terribly under the weight of the household's expectations. One afternoon, Amara found her weeping in the pantry, her hands raw and bleeding from scalding water, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Where any proper English countess would have simply passed by, Amara stopped. She took Catherine's hands, examined the wounds, and quietly instructed her to present herself at the village physician, with a note stating that the expense should be charged to the countess's personal account. The act was revolutionary in its simplicity. No servant at Ravenswood Hall had ever been shown such consideration. The household operated on principles of rigid hierarchy and calculated indifference. Servants were tools, not human beings with bodies that could suffer and hearts that could break. Within hours, Catherine had told every servant in the house that the new countess had shown her kindness. Within a day, the story had reached the kitchens, the laundry, the stables. A countess who noticed a scullery maid's bleeding hands, a countess who paid for a physician's care out of her own allowance. The whispers began, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. Perhaps the household's assessment of Amara Blackwell had been premature. Amara began to move through Ravenswood Hall with deliberate visibility, always impeccably dressed, always gracious, always keenly observant. She learned the names of every servant and used them. She remembered Catherine's wounds and asked about her healing hands. She noticed when the head gardener's wife was ill and sent soup from her own table. She recognized that the footman Thomas had a gift for arranging flowers and began to specifically request his assistance in decorating the drawing room, giving him opportunities to display skills that might otherwise have remained hidden. Each act was calculated, strategic, but it was also genuinely kind. Amara refused to mirror the indifference with which she was being treated. Instead, she elevated those around her through recognition and respect. Yet beneath these acts of deliberate kindness lay a harder calculation. Amara had brought with her from Jamaica documentation of her mother's freedom papers, proof of Zainab's legal emancipation before Amara's birth. She had also obtained a certified copy of her own birth certificate, issued by the Jamaican registrar, documenting her legitimate birth to her father and her mother, both named and legally recorded. She had hidden copies of these documents in multiple locations throughout Ravenswood Hall, tucked behind loose stones in the library, concealed in the binding of an old French novel, secreted in the hem of her traveling cloak. She knew with absolute certainty that her status could be challenged or erased at any moment by men with power and prejudice, and she had taken steps to ensure that she possessed incontrovertible proof of her legitimacy and her right to exist. The Dowager Countess escalated her assault in June, holding a dinner party specifically designed to publicly humiliate Amara by demonstrating the household's dysfunction and the staff's disloyalty. She invited influential members of Parliament, renowned society matrons known for their influence over London's social calendar, and the local bishop, a man of considerable authority whose blessing or condemnation could make or break a woman's social standing. The Dowager Countess informed Edmund that she would be taking over the arrangements for the dinner, subtly suggesting that his new wife was not yet ready for such responsibility. that perhaps he should allow someone with more experience to ensure the event's success. Edmund, emotionally exhausted from weeks of tension and caught between his loyalty to his wife and his filial obligation to his mother, agreed. It was a catastrophic mistake, though none of them understood it in the moment. The Dowager Countess worked with Jasper Whitmore and Mrs. Weatherby in orchestrating what amounted to a coordinated performance, an evening designed to prove that Amara's presence had so corrupted the household that even the most basic service could not be maintained. The servants were instructed to commit errors so obvious they could not be overlooked. Food service would be chaotic, courses would arrive in the wrong order, and at the crucial moment, the assembled witnesses would observe the household's complete inability to function under the new countess's supposed leadership. But Amara had spent weeks building relationships with individual servants, understanding their loyalties and their vulnerabilities, recognizing that beneath the household's coordinated rebellion lay individual human beings struggling with competing obligations. She knew that Catherine, the scullery maid, would remember her bleeding hands being tended. She understood that some of the younger servants, the housemaids and footmen who had never known anything but the rigid hierarchy of Ravenswood Hall, might be capable of seeing beyond the prejudices they had been taught. She recognized that even Mrs. Weatherby, for all her fierce loyalty to the old order, carried within her the capacity for genuine affection, if given reason to exercise it. Most importantly, she had come to understand Jasper Whitmore. The butler was not a cruel man. Cruelty implied passion, and Jasper's racism was far too systematic to be merely emotional. He was a man whose entire identity had been constructed within rigid hierarchies of class and race. Someone who had spent his entire life maintaining an order that now appeared to be crumbling. He represented the institutional racism of Victorian England itself, not personal hatred, but something far more insidious, the absolute certainty that the natural order of the world, the order he had spent 5 decades maintaining, could not and should not be overturned. But Amara suspected that beneath that certainty lay doubt, and if she could cultivate that doubt, she might transform him. 2 weeks before the Dowager Countess's dinner party, Amara requested a private conversation with Jasper in the library. The butler, astonished and affronted by the request, arrived with visible reluctance, his back stiff, his expression professionally neutral. Amara received him seated at a small table rather than from behind the great oak desk, a deliberate choice to signal equality rather than hierarchy. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "I understand that you have served this family with extraordinary dedication for 32 years. Edmund has told me that the household runs smoothly precisely because of your expertise and your commitment to maintaining standards. I respect that. I do not come to Ravenswood Hall to destroy what you have built." Jasper's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes, a moment of confusion, as though the script he had prepared for this conversation had suddenly been rendered irrelevant. "I have come," Amara continued, "because I love Edmund, and I wish to be a good wife to him and a worthy member of this family. I understand that my presence creates difficulties for you, that it challenges the order you have maintained, but I wonder if you have considered whether that order was truly as natural as we have been taught to believe. Can a system truly be natural if it requires constant effort to maintain, if it collapses the moment we stop actively defending it?" She stood and walked to the window, her tone remaining calm and conversational. "I am asking you to consider, Mr. Whitmore, whether you are truly defending tradition or whether you are simply afraid of change." Jasper left the library without responding to her question, but Amara noticed that his departing posture was fractionally less rigid than it had been. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and she had learned long ago that doubt, once introduced, grows whether we wish it to or not. What she did not know was that her words had struck deeper than she could have anticipated. That night, Jasper sat alone in his small room above the servants' hall, a space he had occupied for 32 years, surrounded by the meager possessions of a man who had devoted his entire existence to service. He thought about Amara's question. Was he truly defending tradition or simply afraid of change? The Dowager Countess's dinner party arrived like a theatrical performance, scheduled and orchestrated down to the smallest detail. The guests began to arrive at 8 o'clock, descending from their carriages in silks and diamonds, their faces carefully arranged to suggest they expected nothing but perfection. Amara stood in the entrance hall, dressed in a gown of midnight blue, a color chosen deliberately to avoid the whites and creams that English ladies typically wore, instead claiming a sophistication that bordered on defiance. Her hair was arranged with mathematical precision, not a strand out of place. She was, quite intentionally, perfect. The evening unfolded exactly as the Dowager Countess and her conspirators had planned. The first course arrived cold. The second course was served with such obvious resentment by the footman that even the most oblivious guest could perceive it. By the third course, the carefully choreographed chaos had become apparent to everyone present. This was not mere incompetence, but deliberate sabotage. A member of Parliament, who had been considering supporting Edmund's recent legislative proposals, exchanged meaningful glances with his wife. A society matron, who controlled access to the most exclusive drawing rooms, whispered behind her fan to her neighbor. The Dowager Countess, observing the disaster unfold exactly as she had orchestrated it, allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Edmund sat frozen at the head of the table, his face flushed with helpless rage and humiliation. He wanted to intervene, to dismiss the servants outright, to publicly declare his support for Amara. But any such action would only draw more attention to the household's dysfunction and confirm society's assessment that his marriage had corrupted his judgment. He was trapped between loyalty to his wife and the social catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. Amara, for her part, maintained a facade of serene composure, engaging the bishop in conversation about the charitable works of the church, discussing philosophy with a visiting scholar from Oxford, conducting herself with such flawless grace that several guests found themselves wondering whether they had misread the situation. Then, unexpectedly, the dining room doors opened, and Mrs. Constance Weatherby entered, dressed in her formal housekeeper's blacks, her face grave with purpose. Behind her came Jasper Whitmore, and the butler's expression was one of profound resignation, as though he had made a decision that would require him to surrender something essential to his identity. Mrs. Weatherby moved to the center of the table, and in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent room, announced, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, for this interruption. However, Mr. Whitmore has informed me that he has been conducting himself with gross insubordination, and has requested that I relieve him of his duties effective immediately. He will be departing Ravenswood Hall this evening." The shock rippled through the assembled guests like an electrical current. Jasper Whitmore, the butler who had served the Blackwell family for 3 decades, the man who embodied the household's institutional resistance to the new countess, was being removed by the very housekeeper who had worked alongside him to orchestrate tonight's sabotage. Something fundamental had shifted. Mrs. Weatherby then, with deliberate grace and perfect execution, presented each subsequent course herself, standing beside Amara's chair, her physical presence an undeniable statement of allegiance, and in that simple act of service, she was rewriting the entire narrative of the evening. She was declaring that the household had chosen its mistress. When the Dowager Countess rose from her seat to deliver a carefully prepared speech about the unsuitability of Amara's position and the temporary madness that had afflicted her son, Edmund finally found his voice. He stood, commanding the room through sheer force of will, and announced that his mother's annual allowance was being reduced by half effective immediately, and that she was no longer welcome at Ravenswood Hall except by his explicit and advance invitation. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, and everyone present understood that the young Earl had chosen his wife over his family's established order. The bishop, uncomfortable with the family conflict, but impressed by Edmund's decisive defense of his marriage, rose and offered a blessing for this union joined in love before God, blessed by the Church and sanctified by the sacrament of matrimony. The blessing was subtle but unmistakable. It reframed the marriage as legitimate, as sanctioned by divine authority, as something that transcended the mere prejudices of society. Several guests found themselves nodding, suddenly more sympathetic to the young couple than they had been an hour earlier. After all, who were they to question what God had blessed? And what was the Church's approval, if not a powerful statement that the marriage deserved respect? But it was Mrs. Weatherby's transformation that most surprised everyone who witnessed it. The housekeeper, who had stood beside Jasper in orchestrating the household's resistance, had suddenly reversed course entirely. As the evening concluded and the guests departed, she supervised the clearing of the dining room with a precision that suggested she had never been party to sabotage at all. She ensured that Amara's chambers were properly prepared for the night, that fresh flowers had been placed in every room, that the household had returned to impeccable order. When Amara encountered her in the upstairs corridor, Mrs. Weatherby curtsied, a gesture of deference that had been notably absent for months, and said quietly, "Your ladyship, I have served this house for many years, and I have learned tonight that I was not as wise as I believed myself to be. I hope you will permit me to serve you as faithfully as I have served your husband's family." Amara embraced the older woman, and in that embrace was a recognition of something profound, that Mrs. Weatherby had begun to understand that her loyalty to the family extended not to its past, but to its future. That a household's true strength came not from defending an old order, but from adapting to a new one. That the greatest act of service sometimes requires the courage to change. Jasper Whitmore, meanwhile, departed Ravenswood Hall that very evening, his belongings packed into 2 small trunks. His career of devoted service ended by a decision made in a library conversation and finalized by the public humiliation of the dinner party. He went to live with a distant cousin in the industrial north, taking on work as a porter in a warehouse, a spectacular fall from the position of respected butler to manual laborer, a transformation that the household understood as absolute rejection by his former world. 3 months after the dinner party, Amara gave birth to a son. Thomas Blackwell arrived on a cold February morning, and his appearance settled the question of the marriage's legitimacy in a way that no amount of argument could have done. The child possessed his mother's dark eyes and his father's aristocratic features, a living contradiction to any suggestion that the marriage was unsuitable or that Amara was unworthy of her position. He was impossible to deny or dismiss. He was the future, made flesh, announcing to everyone who looked upon him that the order of the world had fundamentally shifted. Within a year, Jasper Whitmore died of pneumonia in a workhouse, a broken man who could not adapt to a world in which his certainties had been shattered. He had spent 32 years maintaining a hierarchy that had suddenly revealed itself to be fragile enough to overturn through a single act of moral courage. The newspapers carried no obituary for the former butler of Ravenswood Hall. He had become, in death as he had feared becoming in life, invisible. But Amara, upon learning of his passing, wore mourning black for a week and made a substantial donation to the workhouse in his name, acknowledging that even those who had fought against her deserved dignity in their final humiliation. Amara systematically transformed her position from one of precarious acceptance into one of genuine authority. She began by rebuilding loyalty within the household through consistent kindness, fair treatment, and strategic patronage. Catherine, the scullery maid, was promoted to head housemaid within a year. Her bleeding hands eventually healed into the capable, confident hands of a young woman who'd been given opportunity and recognition. Thomas, the footman, with a gift for flowers, became the head gardener, creating gardens around Ravenswood Hall that attracted admiration from visitors and set a new standard for horticultural excellence. Each act of advancement was calculated to demonstrate that loyalty to the new countess brought genuine reward and advancement, while resistance had brought only dismissal and disgrace. More boldly, Amara began to host salons in the drawing rooms of Ravenswood Hall, evening gatherings attended by progressive members of society, intellectuals from Cambridge and Oxford, reformers and philosophers and writers who found in the young countess a mind equal to their own and a platform for ideas that mainstream society often rejected. She invited members of parliament who were beginning to question the morality of imperialism. She welcomed writers who were exploring questions of race and identity. She created a space where ideas that challenged Victorian certainties could be discussed openly and without fear of social censure. Ravenswood Hall gradually transformed from a traditional country estate into a center of progressive thought, a place where the intellectual currents of a changing world could flow freely. Through these salons, Amara began to develop genuine political influence that extended far beyond the domestic sphere. She used her position not merely to secure her own place in society, but to give voice to those without platforms. She publicly advocated for Indian independence, speaking with knowledge born of her colonial background about the brutality of imperial systems and their human cost. She wrote letters to newspapers under her own name, shocking for a woman of her era, but impossible for editors to reject given her title and her evident learning. She corresponded with reformers working to expand educational opportunities for colonized peoples. And gradually, subtly, but unmistakably, she began to shift the conversation around empire, race, and the rights of those deemed inferior by Victorian racial hierarchies. Edmund watched his wife's transformation with something between amazement and humility. The man who had believed that love and personal devotion could overcome institutional systems discovered instead that love required active struggle, constant vigilance, and a willingness to sacrifice comfort for principle. He grew stronger through the conflict, more certain in his commitment to his wife, and more vocal in his support for the social reforms she championed. Their marriage, tested by fire in those early months, emerged deeper and more genuine than it had been even in Jamaica. Edmund began to understand that Amara was not merely his wife, but a prophet of a world that was struggling to be born, a world in which blood and birth and skin color might matter less than character and intellect. Mrs. Constance Weatherby, the housekeeper who had transformed from antagonist to unexpected ally, became something even more important. She became Amara's closest companion within the household. In the evenings, after the servants had retired and Edmund was occupied with estate matters, Amara and Mrs. Weatherby would sit together in the housekeeper's small parlour, and the older woman would tell stories of her decades of service. Gradually, she revealed her own struggles, a brief love affair in her youth that had been deemed unsuitable, a husband lost to illness before they could marry, a life spent in service to a family that could never truly be hers. In Mrs. Weatherby's stories, Amara recognized something of her own experience, the particular loneliness of women who loved families that could never fully acknowledge that love in return. By 1880, Thomas had become a charming, intelligent child with his mother's curiosity and his father's aristocratic bearing. He was presented to the village church as the heir to Ravenswood, and the assembled villagers saw in him the future, a boy who carried in his very being the reality that the world was changing, whether they wished it to or not. Amara bore Edmund 3 more children over the following years: Eleanor in 1881, Henry in 1883, and Catherine in 1885. With each birth, Amara's position in society strengthened. She was no longer an exotic curiosity or a scandalous aberration. She was the mother of the heir, the mistress of a great estate, and increasingly a woman whose opinions on matters of social importance were sought and respected. By 1885, when Thomas was presented at court at the age of 7, an unusual honor for one so young, but one that demonstrated Edmund's determination to ensure his son's full acceptance in aristocratic society. Amara had been transformed from a woman fighting for survival into a woman of genuine power. She wore a gown of deep crimson and gold, and she stood beside her son with such evident pride and such unshakable dignity that society itself seemed to shift around her. The Queen, we are told, remarked favorably on the boy's intelligence and his mother's grace. Whether this was true or merely rumor that spread through London society, it mattered little. The rumor itself became reality through repetition and belief. The Dowager Countess Elizabeth Blackwell died in 1888, having never reconciled with her son and having been forced to watch from her exile at the family's Yorkshire estate, as her daughter-in-law grew more powerful and more accepted with each passing year. She took her bitterness and her broken certainties to the grave, remembered primarily as a woman who had fought against the inevitable and lost. Edmund attended her funeral out of filial obligation, but without the grief that genuine reconciliation might have brought. He stood beside Amara at the graveside, and in that gesture was a final, definitive statement. His loyalties had been remade, his identity reconstructed around his marriage rather than his birth family. Mrs. Constance Weatherby served Amara with unflinching loyalty for 30 more years, becoming more than a housekeeper. She became a companion, a counselor, and eventually a dear friend. When she died in 1920, well into Amara's old age, she was buried not in the servants' cemetery, but in a quiet plot on the Ravenswood estate itself, a grave marked by a stone that read simply, "Constance Weatherby, beloved servant and faithful friend, whose courage transformed a household and herself." In her will, Amara left the older woman a substantial pension and the cottage on the estate where she had lived her final years, ensuring that Mrs. Weatherby's loyalty would be remembered and honored long after her death. Thomas Blackwell grew into a man of extraordinary principle, inheriting his mother's fierce intellect and her commitment to justice, combined with his father's aristocratic authority and access to power. He entered Parliament at 30, representing his constituency with a voting record that scandalized the Conservative establishment. He advocated relentlessly for Indian independence, speaking in the House of Commons with a moral clarity born from watching his mother fight against racial hierarchy within his own home. He supported women's suffrage at a time when such positions could damage a man's political career. He called for dismantling the very colonial systems that had enriched his family's estates, arguing that no wealth could justify the brutality upon which it was built. His colleagues in Parliament whispered that Thomas was his mother's son, that Amara had corrupted him with her foreign ideas and her refusal to accept the natural order of things. They did not understand that what they perceived as corruption was actually transformation, the inevitable result of having been born into a family that had chosen love and justice over comfortable complicity. Thomas spoke of his mother with profound respect, crediting her courage for showing him that the systems he had been raised to accept were not natural or inevitable, but constructed and therefore capable of being reconstructed. He became, in many ways, the living embodiment of everything the Dowager Countess had feared, a man who used his aristocratic privilege not to defend an unjust hierarchy, but to dismantle it. Society's acceptance of Amara accelerated dramatically in the 1890s, driven in part by Thomas's political prominence, in part by the sheer force of her dignity and achievement, and in part by the slow cultural shifts that were making Victorian certainties seem increasingly obsolete. She was invited to the most exclusive drawing rooms in London. She was sought out as a patroness for charitable organizations working in the colonies. She was consulted by reformers and politicians seeking wisdom about imperial policy. By the turn of the 20th century, Amara Blackwell, Countess of Ravenswood, had become not merely an accepted member of aristocratic society, but a respected elder stateswoman whose voice carried weight in conversations about the future of the British Empire. Amara bore 4 children in total, each one a living refutation of the racial hierarchies that had tried so desperately to exclude her. Eleanor became a photographer of considerable talent, using her art to document the lives of working-class women and colonized peoples, work that Amara quietly supported and promoted. Henry became an engineer, designing systems to bring clean water and sanitation to impoverished communities, driven by a conviction that the privileged had an obligation to use their knowledge for the benefit of those without access to it. Catherine, the youngest, became a physician, an extraordinary achievement for a woman of her era, and one made possible only by the social authority and financial resources her mother had fought so hard to secure. Edmund Blackwell died in 1902 at 70 years old, having spent his final decades as a contented country gentleman who had traded much of his political ambition for the satisfaction of watching his wife flourish and his children change the world. His funeral was attended by hundreds, not merely family and neighbors, but politicians and reformers and intellectuals who had come to respect him as a man who had chosen his wife's dignity over his family's comfort, who had used his privilege to defend rather than to perpetuate injustice. Amara mourned him genuinely, understanding that whatever their marriage had been tested by in those early years, they had emerged with something far deeper than the romantic attraction that had first drawn them together. They had built a partnership of shared values and shared purpose. Amara continued to live at Ravenswood Hall after Edmund's death, maintaining the salons and the center of progressive thought that she had established within its walls. She became increasingly focused on writing, producing essays and articles that explored the philosophical and practical implications of colonialism, racism, and the possibility of a more just social order. She corresponded with leading intellectuals of her era, including figures we now recognize as pioneers of anti-colonial and racial justice thought. Her writings were published in progressive journals and newspapers, always under her own name, always bearing the weight of her lived experience and her hard-won authority. By the 1920s, as she entered old age, Amara had become something approaching a living symbol, not merely of one woman's triumph over prejudice, but of the possibility that even the most entrenched systems could be transformed through courage, dignity, and an unshakable refusal to accept erasure. Universities invited her to speak about her experiences. Young reformers and activists sought her counsel. She received letters from people across the British Empire, colonized peoples who had read her writings or heard of her story and who saw in her example evidence that resistance was possible, that dignity could not be permanently suppressed, that the hierarchies that seemed so eternal might be temporary. After all, Amara Blackwell died in 1928 at 78 years old, having lived to see her son become one of the leading voices for Indian independence, having witnessed the beginning of the end of the British Empire's absolute confidence in its own righteousness. She died at Ravenswood Hall, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, in the bed where she had labored to bring forth her firstborn son during those terrifying early months when she had not yet secured her place. She died knowing that the battle she had fought within those walls had reverberated far beyond them, that her refusal to accept erasure had given permission to countless others to refuse their own. Her will was extraordinary in its specificity. She left detailed instructions that her personal papers, her letters, her essays, her journals documenting those early struggles be preserved and eventually made public. She endowed scholarships for colonized students seeking education in British universities. She created a foundation specifically dedicated to supporting women from marginalized communities who were seeking positions of leadership and authority. She left substantial bequests to organizations working for Indian independence, for racial justice, for women's suffrage and equality, and she left explicit instructions that her story, the truth of it, unvarnished and complete, be told to future generations. The servants of Ravenswood Hall mourned her passing with genuine grief. Catherine, who had risen from scullery maid to become Amara's personal companion and confidant, wept without restraint. Thomas the footman, now ancient himself and long retired to a cottage on the estate, spoke of the day the young countess had noticed his bleeding hands and of how that small act of kindness had changed the entire trajectory of his life. The household staff understood, in a way that society at large was still struggling to comprehend, that they had served not merely a woman of birth and title, but a woman of genuine greatness, someone who had used her power not to dominate, but to elevate, not to perpetuate injustice, but to challenge it. In the decades following Amara's death, her story began to circulate among those interested in the history of the British Empire and the resistance to it. Historians discovered her papers, preserved carefully in the Ravenswood archives, and found in them a detailed account of one woman's struggle against systemic racism within the very heart of English aristocracy. Scholars began to recognize that her writings about colonialism and racial hierarchy contained ideas that would not become mainstream in academic discourse for many more decades. They understood that Amara Blackwell had been thinking about questions of power, identity, and justice with a sophistication that anticipated the post-colonial theoretical frameworks that would emerge in the second half of the 20th century. Thomas Blackwell's political career continued to evolve, and his advocacy for Indian independence grew only more passionate as he aged. He lived to see Indian independence achieved in 1947, dying just 2 years later, knowing that the colonial system his family had once profited from had finally crumbled. In his final years, he spoke frequently of his mother, crediting her with having taught him that true loyalty to one's country meant being willing to challenge its injustices, that genuine patriotism required confronting uncomfortable truths about one's own nation and one's own family wealth. He became, in the eyes of many, a model of what privilege could become when allied with conscience, a man who used his inherited authority to dismantle rather than defend the systems that had granted it to him. Eleanor Blackwell's photographic work was rediscovered in the 1970s by feminist art historians who recognized in her images a devastating critique of colonialism and patriarchy long before such critiques became fashionable in artistic circles. Her photographs of working-class women in the industrial cities of England, of colonized peoples in Jamaica and India, of the gap between imperial propaganda and colonial reality, were recognized as extraordinary historical documents and powerful artistic statements. Museums began to acquire her work. Universities used her photographs in courses on visual history and colonial studies. She became recognized posthumously as a pioneering documentary photographer whose work had captured the human reality behind the statistics of imperial exploitation. Henry Blackwell's engineering projects transformed the lives of thousands of people in impoverished communities across Britain and in the colonies. His systems for clean water and sanitation, implemented in slums and colonial territories, saved countless lives from disease and suffering. Though he worked largely without public recognition during his lifetime, engineering being a field dominated by men focused on profit rather than human welfare. His legacy was eventually acknowledged by public health historians who recognized that his work had prevented epidemics and reduced mortality in ways that rivaled the achievements of more celebrated medical pioneers. He had embodied his mother's conviction that privilege carried with it an obligation to use one's gifts for the benefit of those without access to power or resources. Catherine Blackwell became one of the first female physicians to establish a practice specializing in the health of working class and colonized women. She faced the same resistance that her mother had faced in earlier years: dismissal, condescension, the suggestion that her presence in the medical profession was unsuitable and unnatural. But she had inherited her mother's unshakable conviction that unsuitable and unnatural were simply synonyms for threatening to those invested in maintaining unjust hierarchies. She worked tirelessly to document the ways that racism and poverty created distinct patterns of disease and suffering among colonized populations and working-class communities. Her research laid groundwork for what would eventually become the field of social medicine, recognizing that health was not merely individual, but profoundly shaped by social structures and power hierarchies. In the second half of the 20th century, as the British Empire finally dissolved, and as conversations about race, colonialism, and racial justice moved from the margins to the center of intellectual and political discourse, Amara Blackwell's story began to be recognized as historically significant in new ways. Scholars of colonialism cited her writings. Historians of race studied her correspondence. Feminists analyzed her strategies for acquiring and wielding power within patriarchal structures. She became recognized not merely as a woman who had overcome personal prejudice, but as someone who had understood the structural nature of racial and imperial hierarchies, and who had devoted her life to undermining them. Yet perhaps her greatest legacy was not in the writings that scholars studied, or the political movements that her children championed, but in the simple fact that she had refused erasure. She had stood at the bottom of the grand staircase of Ravenswood Hall and accepted Jasper Whitmore's rejection not as the final word, but as the opening move in a battle she was determined to win. She had lived in a society that told her she was unsuitable, unnatural, a corruption of aristocratic blood, and she had responded by becoming so undeniably competent, so obviously wise, so clearly deserving of respect that even those committed to her exclusion eventually had to acknowledge her worth. She had demonstrated through her life that systemic oppression bends around individual courage but breaks under collective transformation. A woman who refuses erasure becomes a mirror that forces everyone around her to see themselves. And some, like Mrs. Weatherby and eventually even the servants who had participated in the household's sabotage, will choose to see themselves truly. They will recognize their own complicity in unjust systems and will find themselves capable of change. Others, like Jasper Whitmore, will be broken by the confrontation with their own blindness and will be unable to survive the shattering of certainties they had built their entire identities upon. But either way, the woman who refuses to disappear has fundamentally altered the world around her. She has made it impossible for those systems to function as they did before. She has cracked the foundation, and through that crack, light begins to enter. The greatest threat to unjust hierarchies is not revolution from without, but the quiet dignity of those deemed inferior, standing immovably in spaces they were told they could never occupy. Amara Blackwell stood in Ravenswood Hall and claimed her place not through violence or aggression, but through an absolute refusal to accept that her skin color or her colonial birth made her unsuitable for authority and respect. She stood there day after day, year after year, until the household adjusted itself around her, until society restructured itself to accommodate her presence, until the very foundations of racial hierarchy within that microcosm had been transformed. And in transforming Ravenswood Hall, she contributed to the transformation of something far larger, the slow, grinding shift in human consciousness that would eventually make the certainties of Victorian racism seem not merely wrong, but incomprehensible. If you wish for more stories of quiet resistance and revolutionary dignity, of women who refused to accept the cages society built around them, and of the transformative power of standing immovably in forbidden spaces, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. For in an empire built upon the certainty of racial hierarchy and the erasure of those deemed inferior, the most radical act was simply to exist, to demand recognition, to refuse to be forgotten. Amara Blackwell did all three, and in doing so, she became a prophet of a world that was struggling to be born, a world in which blood and birth and skin color might matter less than character, courage, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Her journey teaches us that the systems that seem most eternal, most natural, most impossible to change, are often far more fragile than we believe, vulnerable to the quiet persistence of those who refuse to accept their designated place within them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the hidden corridors of Ravenswood Hall, where one woman's dignity rewrote the rules of an empire.